Damon Caldwell was 41 years old, and for 12 years he had been the invisible infrastructure of his wife's success. While Yvette climbed toward the CEO title she had wanted her entire life, Damon managed their finances, raised their daughter Nadia, and ran a household with the same quiet precision he brought to every structure he had ever built. He never complained. He never asked for credit. He simply believed in what they were building together. The morning after Yvette's board approval, she walked into his home office dressed for her first day at the top, set a manila envelope on his desk, and told him she'd had the papers drawn up a month ago. Divorce papers. Then she left for work. What Damon found when he opened that envelope told him everything. Not just that she was leaving, but that she had been planning it for nearly 2 years. And when he pulled up the joint investment account he had managed since the day they married, the number staring back at him confirmed what kind of woman he had spent 12 years protecting. $340,000 transferred out, incrementally, deliberately, while he made their daughters lunch and kept their accounts and stayed quiet because he believed in her. She filed thinking she already knew exactly what Damon Caldwell was worth. She had never been more wrong in her life. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light filtered through the renovated kitchen windows of the Caldwell home in Cascade Heights. Damon had installed those windows himself 3 summers ago, along with the custom cabinets and the marble countertops that now gleamed under the pendant lights. Like everything else he built, they were perfect. Measured twice, cut once, secured to last. He moved through his morning routine with practiced ease, the sound of eggs sizzling in the pan, mixing with the quiet hum of CNN from the living room. The kitchen was his domain, had been for years now. He knew every inch of it, from the slight catch in the refrigerator door he'd been meaning to fix to the exact temperature the burner needed to be for perfectly crispy bacon edges. "Dad, can you check my math?" Nadia asked from her spot at the kitchen island, her worksheet spread out between bites of toast. Her dark curls were pulled back in neat braids, another morning ritual, one they shared before school. "Let me see," Damon said, sliding the eggs onto a plate while glancing at her work. Numbers were their language, had been since she was little. She had his mind for patterns, for seeing how things connected. The sound of heels clicking on hardwood announced Yvette's arrival before she appeared. She moved past them like a well-dressed ghost, her navy suit impeccable, her presence somehow both commanding and absent at the same time. She'd come home late last night after the board approval celebration, smelling of expensive wine and victory. "There's coffee," Damon offered, though she was already reaching for her travel mug. "Thanks," she said, not really looking at him. Her mind was clearly elsewhere, probably already in her new corner office, already living in the future she'd been building toward. Nadia perked up. "Mom, are you going to be home for dinner? We could celebrate." "I'll probably be late again, sweetie." "Big day." Yvette pressed a quick kiss to Nadia's forehead, her lipstick leaving no mark. She'd learned long ago how to touch things without leaving traces. Damon watched this exchange while cleaning up the breakfast dishes, his movements efficient and quiet. He'd learned to make himself smaller over the years, to take up less space as Yvette's presence grew. It wasn't something he'd planned or even really noticed happening. It had just become the shape of things. After getting Nadia off to school, Damon settled into his home office. The morning sun warmed the dark wood of his desk, another piece he'd restored himself. His laptop displayed a consulting bid he'd been reviewing, the kind of work he still did between managing the household and being there for Nadia's after-school activities. The click of Yvette's heels approached again, different now, purposeful. He looked up to see her in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. She looked every inch the CEO she'd just become. Tailored suit, perfect posture, an expression that suggested she was already thinking about her next meeting. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a manila envelope on his desk. The sound of it hitting the wood surface somehow both soft and final. "I had these drawn up last month," she said, her voice professional, detached. "I think we both know this hasn't been working." Then she was gone, her heels marking her retreat, the front door opening and closing with a quiet finality. The house settled into silence around him. Damon sat completely still, looking at the envelope. It was clean, crisp, unmarked except for a slight crease in one corner. He didn't reach for it, didn't open it. He knew what it contained. You didn't need to be a structural engineer to recognize the shape of demolition when you saw it. His stillness wasn't paralysis. It wasn't shock. It was the practiced pause of a man who built things for a living, who knew that you had to understand the full scope of damage before you could begin repairs, or, in some cases, before you could decide if repair was even the right approach. The morning light continued to move across his desk, catching the edge of the envelope, making its edges glow. Damon remained motionless, his coffee cooling beside him, his mind working with the same precision he applied to load-bearing calculations. This was who he was, a man who thought before he moved, who measured before he cut, who understood that the most critical moments required absolute stillness first. The silence stretched around him, not empty, but full of potential energy, like a building in the moment before the first brick is laid. The envelope opened with a clean tear, like a surgical incision. Damon pulled out the stack of papers, each page crisp and pristine, free of the wrinkles or coffee stains that marked rushed decisions. His eyes moved methodically through the document, reading with the same attention he gave to structural specifications. The language was precise, clinical. Each paragraph laid out their 12 years of marriage like items in a liquidation sale. The house, the one he'd renovated room by room, was marked for Yvette. Primary custody of Nadia would go to her, with his visitation restricted to every other weekend and one weekday evening. The spousal support calculations were based on his current part-time consulting work, as if the engineering license hanging on his wall was merely decorative. This wasn't a document born from last night's celebration. This was architecture. Every clause had been carefully constructed, every asset methodically divided. The date at the bottom confirmed what she'd said. These had been drawn up a month ago, while she was still kissing him goodbye in the mornings and asking about Nadia's math homework. Damon set the papers down and opened his laptop. The familiar banking interface greeted him. He'd managed their joint accounts since before they were married, tracking everything in detailed spreadsheets with the precision his profession demanded. He navigated to their investment account, the one that had been steadily growing for their retirement, for Nadia's college. The numbers didn't make sense at first. The balance was wrong, significantly wrong. He pulled up the transaction history, expanding it to show the past 2 years. What he found made his hands go still on the keyboard. The withdrawals were like perfectly spaced footprints in snow. Every 3 months, just after his quarterly reviews, amounts between $12,000 and $18,000 had vanished. The transfers were timed precisely to fall in the gaps of his attention, each one small enough to not trigger immediate concern if noticed, but adding up to $340,000 over 22 months. He traced the transfers to their destination, a joint account belonging to Yvette and Derek Ashton. The name hit him like a physical thing. Derek Ashton, the CFO she'd brought in 26 months ago. The timing wasn't coincidental. The financial bleeding had started almost immediately after Derek's arrival. The affair wasn't new. The theft wasn't impulsive. This was a strategy that had been executing for almost 2 years while he made breakfast, helped with homework, and kept their home running. Damon reached for his phone, scrolling to Terrence's number. Terrence had been his friend since college, before Yvette, before any of this. He was also one of the best forensic accountants in Atlanta. He he said when Terrence answered, his voice steady. "I need you to come by tonight. Bring your laptop." "Everything okay?" Terrence asked, knowing from Damon's tone that it wasn't. "No, but it will be. Just come by after work." He spent the rest of the day moving through the house like a ghost, touching the things he'd built, seeing them with new eyes, the custom shelving in Nadia's room, the rebuilt deck out back, the kitchen he'd designed around Yvette's love of entertaining. All of it had been infrastructure for a life she'd been dismantling piece by piece. That evening, after Terrence confirmed everything and promised to dig deeper, Damon picked up his phone again. His hands were steady as he dialed Yvette's number. When she answered, he made his voice shake just enough, a precise tremor, like a controlled demolition. "I got the papers," he said, letting his words catch slightly. I need some time to process this. I don't understand, Yvette. 12 years, and you didn't? We didn't even try counseling. I love you. I thought we were happy." The silence on her end lasted 3 seconds. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, almost kind. The relief in it was audible. She believed his performance completely. "Take whatever time you need," she said softly. "I know this is hard. We can talk more when you're ready." They hung up, and Damon set his phone down carefully on his desk. In the quiet of his home office, surrounded by the life he'd built, and the evidence of its systematic dismantling, he sat perfectly still. His stillness wasn't defeat. It was focus, sharp and clear as diamond. The following evening, Terrence's sedan pulled into Damon's driveway just after 7. Damon met him at the door, leading him straight to the kitchen table where he'd laid out his laptop and a series of printed statements. The kitchen lights cast sharp shadows across the documents, making the numbers stand out like accusations. "Thanks for coming," Damon said, his voice measured. He pulled out a chair and gestured for Terrence to sit. "I need you to see something." Terrence set his own laptop down and settled in, his expression neutral. He'd known Damon long enough to recognize when his friend was operating from pure logic rather than emotion. This was Damon in engineering mode, treating betrayal like a structural problem that needed solving. "Start from the beginning," Terrence said, opening his computer. Damon walked through the evidence with the same precision he used when presenting building specifications to clients. He showed Terrence the divorce filing first, then pulled up the account statements. His finger traced the pattern of transfers, each one falling neatly between his quarterly reviews. 340,000, Damon said quietly. Over 22 months. Always between 12 and 18,000. Always time to fall after I'd done the quarterly household review. Terrence's fingers moved across his keyboard, his eyes narrowing as he pulled up databases and ran searches. The room was silent, except for the soft tapping of keys and the distant hum of the refrigerator. "The receiving account," Terrence said after several minutes. "Joint holders are Yvette Caldwell and Derek Ashton. Opened 26 months ago, right after he was hired as CFO. "Can you trace the pattern?" Damon asked. Terrence nodded, already working. "Give me an hour." While Terrence dug deeper, Damon made coffee. He moved through his kitchen with the same quiet efficiency he always had. But now, each familiar motion felt like walking through a house he'd just discovered was built on sand. He'd made coffee in this kitchen thousands of times, while Yvette planned her exit, one transfer at a time. 2 hours later, Terrence had assembled a complete timeline. The transfers were methodical, planned to avoid detection. The account showed regular activity between Yvette and Derek. Dinner charges, hotel stays, weekend trips disguised as business travel. The affair and the theft were perfectly synchronized. A dual betrayal executed with corporate precision. "I know a family law attorney," Terrence said, turning his laptop to show Damon the evidence he'd compiled. "Patricia Osei. She handles high-asset divorces, knows her way around financial fraud. Want me to make a call?" Damon nodded. "But tell her I don't want to move on anything yet. I need everything documented first." Patricia arrived the next morning, her briefcase heavy with similar cases she'd handled. She spread the divorce filing across the kitchen table, next to Terrence's financial analysis. Her reading was quick but thorough, her occasional nods suggesting she was finding exactly what she expected. "She's made 3 critical mistakes," Patricia said finally, looking up at Damon. "First, she's grossly underestimated your earning capacity. Your engineering license and consulting history alone make her spousal support calculations invalid. Second, she's assumed you have no independent assets or professional network. And third, she's committed documented financial fraud by transferring marital assets without disclosure." "What's your advice?" Damon asked. "Sign nothing. Respond to nothing." Patricia stacked the papers with precise movements. "Let her think you're overwhelmed, processing, moving slowly. Every day she believes you're paralyzed is another day we have to build our response." Damon absorbed this, then stood. "Give me a minute." He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his footsteps silent on carpet he'd installed himself. Nadia's door was slightly ajar, and he could hear her soft breathing in the darkness. He stood in the hallway, watching his daughter sleep, feeling the weight of what was coming settle around his shoulders. When he returned downstairs, his expression was set. He looked at Patricia and Terrence, still seated at his kitchen table with their laptops and legal pads. "She filed before she thought I'd look," he said quietly. "Let's make sure that stays her assumption." The morning sun filtered through the windows of Damon's home office, casting long shadows across his desk. With Nadia safely at school, he pulled open the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet and extracted a thick manila folder labeled Property and Investments. The folder was heavy with years of documentation, a habit ingrained from his engineering career where every calculation, every decision had to be traceable. He spread the contents across his desk methodically. Bank statements, tax records, consulting contracts, and property documents formed a paper timeline of their marriage. But there, buried in the middle of it all, was something Yvette had never bothered to ask about: the deed to a commercial property in West Atlanta. 6 years ago, his consulting practice had hit an unexpected surge. Major infrastructure projects had lined up perfectly, creating an 18-month window where his income had nearly tripled. He remembered mentioning it to Yvette over dinner one night, but she had been preoccupied with her own career developments, barely glancing up from her phone. The property had been a calculated risk at the time. The West Atlanta corridor was largely underdeveloped, with empty storefronts and ambitious city plans that hadn't materialized yet. But Damon had seen the potential. It was what he did for a living, after all, analyzing infrastructure and predicting growth patterns. He'd paid cash, $380,000, for a 2-story commercial building with good bones and better location. He lifted the most recent appraisal from the stack. The surrounding area had transformed exactly as he'd predicted. New restaurants had opened, boutique shops had moved in, and property values had soared. His building, now fully renovated and housing 2 successful businesses, was conservatively valued at $1.1 million. The rental income flowed steadily into a separate account, reinvested in property maintenance and improvements. Damon picked up his phone and called Patricia. "The commercial property," he said when she answered. "I need to confirm its status." He could hear papers shuffling on her end. "The deed is dated 13 months before your marriage," Patricia said. "You paid cash, no financing. No marital funds have ever been used for maintenance or improvements. The rental income covered all that. There's no marital debt attached." She paused. "Mr. Caldwell, this property is entirely yours." Damon absorbed this information, adding it to his mental calculations. While the file lay open before him, he opened his laptop and began reaching out to his professional network. A series of brief, carefully worded emails to former clients and colleagues, people whose projects he'd had to turn down when Yvette's schedule became more demanding. The responses came quickly. They remembered him. More importantly, they remembered his work. A major infrastructure firm had been trying to pull him in for months. Their latest project, a $2.3 million municipal contract, needed someone with exactly his expertise. His phone buzzed with another incoming email, then another. The network he'd built over decades of precise work and reliable delivery was still there, still solid. He'd scaled back his practice but never abandoned it entirely. Another detail Yvette had missed in her rush to dismiss him. Damon leaned back in his chair, surveying the paper landscape of his quiet competence spread across the desk. The property deed, the consulting contracts, the appraisals and rental agreements, years of careful documentation and strategic patience, all invisible to a woman who had stopped seeing him long ago. He thought about Yvette in her CEO office, probably sitting in meetings right now, confident she had assessed his worth correctly. She had looked at his scaled-back consulting work and seen limitation. She had noticed his focus on their home and assumed confinement. She had measured his patience and mistaken it for passivity. With deliberate movements, Damon gathered the documents and returned them to their folder. The property deed went on top, its legal language stark and clear. He closed the file slowly, feeling its weight in his hands. The weight of all the things his wife had never bothered to see. "I was never small," he said quietly to the empty office. "You just stopped looking." Patricia's downtown office occupied a corner suite in a glass and steel high-rise, its conference room offering sweeping views of Atlanta's skyline. Damon arrived precisely on time, carrying 2 accordion files and his laptop. He began laying out documents with the same methodical precision he applied to engineering projects, each category in its own space, everything accessible, nothing hidden. "Walk me through it all," Patricia said, settling into her chair with a legal pad. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had seen thousands of cases and knew exactly how to build an ironclad strategy. Damon started with his consulting history, spreading out contracts and client testimonials across the polished conference table. "I scaled back 5 years ago to support Yvette's schedule, but I never stopped completely. These are my major projects from the last decade." He pulled out a particularly substantial contract. "This municipal infrastructure project? I led the structural analysis team. The client still calls me for consultations." Patricia studied the documentation carefully, making detailed notes. "Your earning capacity is significantly higher than what her filing suggests. We can easily reconstruct your true professional value using these contracts and client relationships." She looked up at him. "She built her entire strategy on the assumption that you had limited yourself permanently." "That's not all," Damon said, opening the second file. He laid out the commercial property documentation, the original deed, renovation records, tenant agreements, and current appraisal. "I purchased this 13 months before we married. Cash transaction, no financing. The rental income has covered all maintenance and improvements." Patricia's eyes sharpened as she reviewed the property records. "This is completely separate from marital assets. The timing of the purchase and the absence of marital funds in its maintenance makes it presumptively yours." She made another note. "The current value is significant. Did she know about this?" "She never asked," Damon said quietly. "I mentioned the purchase once, but she wasn't interested in the details of my work by then." "And the fraudulent transfers?" Patricia pulled out the forensic analysis Terrence had prepared. 22 months of systematic withdrawals, carefully timed to avoid detection. This isn't just divorce strategy. This is civil financial fraud. We can pursue full recovery, plus damages. As they were reviewing the transfer documentation, Damon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. An email from Marcus Chen, the lead partner at Infrastructure Solutions, one of the largest municipal engineering firms in the Southeast. They had a new contract that needed his expertise. A 3-year, $2.3 million engagement with renewal options and potential partnership consideration. "Perfect timing," Patricia said, reading his expression. "This further establishes your professional position." How do you want to handle it? Damon composed a careful response to Marcus, asking them to hold the offer for 2 weeks while he resolved a personal matter. We don't show this card yet, he said. Let Yvette keep believing what she assumed about my career prospects. Patricia nodded approvingly. You understand strategy. Now, about these transfers, we need to establish a clear timeline of when they began relative to her promotion track at Harmon Lux. The correlation between her career advancement and her systematic draining of marital assets tells a compelling story. They spent the next hour mapping out the legal approach. Patricia built a timeline on her whiteboard, connecting the financial fraud to the broader pattern of deception. Your wife made 2 critical mistakes, she said finally. She assumed you wouldn't look closely at the accounts, and she dramatically underestimated your independent financial position. Damon gathered his documents with the same care he'd shown laying them out. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the conference room. She's been making assumptions about me for years, he said. I think it's time we let her keep making them for just a little longer. Leaving Patricia's office, he pulled out his phone and called Terrence. His friend answered on the first ring. I need you to dig deeper into Harmon Lux, Damon said without preamble. Focus on the financial structure of Yvette's promotion to CEO. Look at board approvals, any unusual transactions, especially anything involving Derek Ashton's department. You think there's more? Terrence asked. People who get comfortable taking what isn't theirs rarely stop at one account, Damon replied. And Derek's been CFO for 26 months. That's a lot of time to build patterns. Give me a week, Terrence said. I'll have something for you. 3 days after the meeting with Patricia, Damon's phone lit up with Terrence's name. His friend's voice was carefully neutral. We need to talk. In person. Tonight work? Hours later, they sat at Damon's kitchen table, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the dishwasher. Nadia was asleep upstairs, her homework finished, her routine maintained despite everything shifting beneath the surface. Terrence spread documents across the table with precise movements, each paper positioned deliberately. This goes beyond the marital accounts, Terrence said, his voice low. Way beyond. Harmon Lux is in pre-IPO registration. They're positioning for a public offering within 18 months. He pulled out a series of financial records. But there's something wrong with their disclosure filing. Damon leaned forward, studying the documents. Years of reviewing structural analyses had taught him to spot patterns in complex data. Show me. When they structured Yvette's CEO appointment, there were a series of transactions through a vendor account. Terrence pointed to highlighted entries. The account is controlled by Derek's department. On paper, it looks like standard operational expenses, but when you trace the money, he laid out another document. It went to clear personal debts, Yvette's debts, Derek's debts, over $800,000 of company funds, redirected through fake vendor invoices. Damon sat back, processing, during a pre-IPO period, which makes it securities fraud. Terrence's finger traced the transaction dates. The timing matches perfectly with her appointment. And here's the thing. These transactions required board-level approval. Philip Harmon either knew or deliberately chose not to know what his daughter and her CFO were doing. He handed her the company, Damon said quietly, and she treated it the same way she treated our marriage, like something to be stripped for parts. I've got a colleague who specializes in pre-IPO compliance issues, Terrence added. We can have an exploratory conversation. No formal filing yet, just establishing options. Damon nodded slowly. Do it, but keep it unofficial for now. He studied the documents again, seeing not just numbers, but leverage points, structural weaknesses in the edifice Yvette had built. I need to talk to Philip first. The next morning, Damon drove to the Harmon house in Buckhead, the house where Yvette grew up, where he'd spent countless family dinners in happier times. Philip answered the door himself, his expression guarded, but not unwelcoming. Can we talk? Damon asked simply. They sat in Philip's study, a room lined with books and achievements, the foundation of everything Yvette had inherited. Damon didn't pull out documents. He didn't make accusations. He simply looked at his father-in-law and asked, "Did you know she had this planned for a while, sir?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Philip's face showed a flicker of shame before settling into resignation. He didn't answer, but his silence said everything. "Thank you for your time," Damon said, standing. He meant it sincerely. Philip's wordless confirmation was exactly what he needed. That evening, after Terence confirmed his colleague was willing to have an informal discussion about securities compliance issues, Damon sat alone in his home office. The house was quiet again, Nadia asleep upstairs, her world still intact despite the tremors building beneath it. He spread everything across his desk, the marital account records showing Yvette's systematic theft, the commercial property documentation she never knew about, the consulting contracts proving his true earning capacity, and now the Harmon Lux records revealing corporate fraud. Each piece was a card in his hand, and he held them all. The weight of this knowledge settled around him like familiar gravity. He had spent years building things to last. Buildings, investments, his daughter's sense of security. Now he would use that same patience to dismantle what needed to fall. He wouldn't play these cards randomly. He wouldn't play them in anger. He would play them precisely, strategically, each revelation timed for maximum effect. Yvette had spent years underestimating him, seeing only what she expected to see. She had no idea he'd been building this moment, without even knowing he needed to. 2 weeks had passed since Yvette handed Damon the divorce papers when his phone buzzed with a text from her. "We should discuss transitioning the household. Coffee tomorrow? Also, I've been looking at some rental listings that might work for you." Damon read the message twice, noting her careful choice of words. Not their household. The household. She was already rewriting the narrative, casting him as someone who needed her guidance to find an apartment. He replied with simple agreement, suggesting the quiet coffee shop near her office. The next morning, he arrived early, ordered 2 coffees, hers exactly as she liked it, with almond milk and a hint of vanilla, and chose a table by the window. When Yvette walked in, she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who believed they controlled the situation completely. "I got your usual," Damon said, sliding her coffee across the table. She looked surprised, then pleased, exactly the reaction of someone who interpreted consideration as submission. "Thank you," she said, settling into her chair. "I appreciate how reasonable you're being about all this." Damon nodded, his expression open and attentive. "I've had some time to process. The main thing is making sure Nadia feels secure through the transition." Yvette relaxed visibly, her shoulders dropping slightly. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. I've been thinking about the custody schedule, and I know my hours are demanding right now with the new position." "We can work around your schedule," Damon said, his voice warm with practiced patience. "Maybe alternate weekends, and then evenings when you're free. Nadia understands you're busy." Something flickered across Yvette's face, a flash of guilt, quickly suppressed. For just a moment, she seemed to see him as he used to be, the supportive husband who made everything work, who kept their world turning while she climbed. But the moment passed, replaced by the cool efficiency she'd cultivated. "That could work," she said, pulling out her phone to make notes. "About the house, I really think renting would be best for you initially. There's a nice complex near Nadia's school. 2 bedrooms, covered parking." Damon made thoughtful sounds, asked relevant questions about lease terms, nodded at appropriate moments. He watched Yvette grow more animated as she outlined his smaller future, her relief at his apparent compliance evident in every gesture. After 45 minutes of productive planning, all of which would be irrelevant by next Friday, they wrapped up the meeting. Yvette touched his arm briefly as she stood to leave. "This means a lot, Damon, that we can handle this like adults." He smiled, the same smile he'd given her for years. "I just want what's best for everyone." As soon as Yvette left the coffee shop, she called Derek. Damon knew this because Terrence had quietly secured access to her call records days ago. The call lasted 4 minutes. Later that afternoon, Terrence forwarded him the surveillance transcript. "He's taking it better than I expected. I always told you, he doesn't really fight." That same day, Damon signed the infrastructure contract he'd been holding. $2.3 million over 3 years, with partnership potential. He filed the executed agreement in his office at home, alongside the commercial property documents, and everything else Yvette had never bothered to notice. Patricia called to confirm the formal disclosure meeting was set for Friday at 10 a.m. in the Peachtree Street offices of her firm. "Everything's prepared," she said. "The forensic accounting report, the property documentation, the earning capacity analysis, and the Harmon Lux materials?" "Ready," Damon confirmed. "How long do you think it will take?" "Once we start presenting, maybe 30 minutes before her attorney asks for a recess. They won't get one." Damon looked out his home office window at the yard he'd landscaped himself, the flower beds he'd planted with Nadia last spring. 30 minutes, he repeated softly. 12 years undone in 30 minutes. "Not undone," Patricia corrected. "Accurately seen, for the first time." After hanging up, Damon sat at his desk, surrounded by the evidence of everything he'd built, while Yvette assumed he was standing still. The meeting was set. The strategy was in place. Years of documentation and quiet competence were about to become a precision weapon. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear. Damon adjusted his tie in the elevator mirror as it climbed to the 24th floor of the Peachtree Street law office. Patricia stood beside him, wheeling a leather briefcase containing 3 carefully organized folders. Neither spoke. The preparation was complete. Now, it was simply time to execute. The conference room commanded a view of downtown Atlanta through floor-to-ceiling windows. Damon helped Patricia arrange the documents in precise stacks on the polished mahogany table. Financial records to her left, property documentation directly in front of her, and the Harmon Lux materials to her right. Each page was tagged with colored markers, every exhibit numbered and indexed. "Water?" Patricia asked, gesturing to the crystal pitcher on the credenza. "I'm good," Damon replied, taking his seat. He adjusted his cuffs, a habit from years of client presentations. The room felt familiar. He'd sat in hundreds of conference rooms like this one, reviewing structural plans and contract terms. The only difference was that today, he was the architecture. At exactly 10 a.m., Yvette arrived with her attorney, Harrison Wells, from one of Atlanta's most prestigious firms. Yvette wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. She carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who believed they were about to efficiently conclude an unpleasant task. "Good morning," Wells said, setting his briefcase on the table. "Shall we begin with a review of the marital assets?" "Of course," Patricia replied, her tone professionally neutral. "I have prepared a complete disclosure package." She slid the first folder across the table. Wells opened it, and Damon watched the subtle shift in his expression as he began reading. The attorney's eyebrows lifted slightly at the earning capacity analysis, documentation of Damon's consulting history, client testimonials, and the network of professional relationships he'd maintained even while scaling back. Yvette leaned forward, frowning. This wasn't the modest asset schedule she'd expected. Patricia continued methodically, sliding the commercial property documentation across next. "This is the deed and current market valuation for Mr. Caldwell's commercial property in West Atlanta, purchased outright before the marriage. Current value, $1.1 million with established tenant income." Yvette's head snapped up. "What property?" "The one you never asked about," Damon said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken. Patricia proceeded without pause, presenting the executed infrastructure contract. Mr. Caldwell's new consulting engagement, $2.3 million over 3 years, with partnership options. Wells was already reaching for his legal pad, but Patricia wasn't finished. She opened the third folder and began laying out the forensic accounting analysis. 22 months of systematic transfers from the marital accounts to the joint account belonging to Yvette and Derek Ashton. We have documented $340,000 in undisclosed transfers, Patricia stated. The pattern suggests deliberate concealment. I'd like to request a brief recess, Wells interjected. No, Patricia said simply. We're not finished. She placed the final document on the table. The Harmon Lux analysis detailing the company fund misappropriation, the vendor account manipulation, and the pre-IPO disclosure violations. The room went completely still. This material, Patricia continued, has been reviewed by Securities Compliance Counsel. No regulatory filing has been made. That decision remains in Mr. Caldwell's discretion. Yvette's carefully maintained composure cracked. She looked at Damon, really looked at him. For the first time in years, what she saw was not the man she'd dismissed. He sat perfectly straight, perfectly calm, radiating a quiet power she'd somehow never noticed. Damon met her gaze and spoke directly to her. I supported everything you built. I asked for nothing. You planned this for 2 years while I made Nadia's lunch and kept your accounts and stayed quiet because I believed in us. I need you to understand that I see all of it. I need you to understand who you decided to underestimate. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket with the same careful precision he'd always brought to everything, and walked out. Patricia remained to handle the details. Yvette sat in the conference room after Damon's departure, her expensive blazer suddenly feeling like costume jewelry. Wells was already speaking in careful tones about managing expectations and limiting exposure, but Yvette barely heard him. The expression on her face wasn't grief. It was the particular look of someone who has just realized the game they thought they were winning was never theirs to win. Patricia's office called early Monday morning. Yvette's counsel wants to discuss settlement terms. They're looking to move quickly. I imagine they are, Damon replied, his voice calm. He sat at his kitchen table, reviewing contractor bids for the renovation projects he'd been planning. The morning sun streamed through the windows he'd installed himself years ago. The negotiations proceeded with remarkable speed. Wells, understanding the devastating exposure his client faced, approached the process with uncharacteristic flexibility. Each point of contention dissolved under the weight of what Patricia held in her files. The threat of corporate fraud exposure made traditional posturing impossible. Within days, the framework emerged. Damon would retain the family home, the 4-bedroom in Cascade Heights, that held both memories and equity. The property's value had increased significantly since his renovations. He had already identified a historic craftsman in West End that needed exactly the kind of careful restoration he excelled at. The home sale proceeds would fund both the purchase and the improvements. The financial settlement was comprehensive, full recovery of the transferred marital assets plus substantial damages. Patricia had calculated the interest meticulously, accounting for both the direct transfers and the opportunity costs. The final number made Wells wince, but he didn't argue. Custody arrangements proved equally decisive. Damon received primary physical custody of Nadia. Yvette's visitation schedule would work around his, a complete reversal of her original filing's assumptions. The judge, reviewing the documentation of Damon's consistent presence in Nadia's life against Yvette's increasingly absent one, approved without hesitation. While the divorce proceedings moved toward conclusion, parallel tremors shook Harmon Lux. Philip Harmon, confronted by his daughter with the full scope of Terrence's findings, made the hard choice loyalty had prevented earlier. He initiated a board-level audit, triggered by what he carefully termed irregularities in vendor payment processing. The audit results were swift and damning. Derek Ashton was terminated for cause 3 days after the preliminary findings reached the board. His office was cleared on a Friday afternoon, his credentials deactivated while he was still in the building. The vendor account documentation alone justified his removal. The personal relationship with the CEO during the period in question made it unappealable. The board's response to Yvette's role was more complex, but equally severe. They installed a compliance officer with direct oversight of all financial decisions, effectively creating a shadow CEO position above her. The IPO process, which had been approaching final stages, was suspended indefinitely. The company Yvette had spent her life pursuing became a carefully monitored cage. None of this played out in public. There were no press releases about Derek's departure, no announcements about the IPO delay. Corporate consequences moved through official channels, board resolutions, and carefully worded internal memoranda. Real power operated in quiet rooms, through proper procedures, with pristine documentation. On a Wednesday afternoon, Damon sat in Patricia's office, reviewing the final settlement documents. Each page represented a point of leverage, converted to concrete consequence. He signed methodically, his engineer's habit of checking every detail, unchanged by circumstance. "Congratulations," Patricia said, as he signed the last page. "You handled this perfectly." Damon stood and shook her hand. "Thank you for building it right." He left her office and drove to Nadia's school, arriving just as the dismissal bell rang. She bounded down the steps, her backpack bouncing, and slid into the passenger seat with the particular energy of 10-year-olds everywhere. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked, studying his face with the perceptiveness children often surprise adults with. Damon thought about the settlement documents in his briefcase, about the house he would build for them, about the quiet satisfaction of consequences properly constructed. He smiled at his daughter, the real smile, the one that reached his eyes. Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. The West End craftsman stood transformed after 18 months of careful restoration. Damon had rebuilt it piece by piece, evening by evening, weekend by weekend. The original hardwood floors now gleamed with a warm patina, each board hand-sanded and refinished. The wraparound porch, once sagging, now invited long conversations in deep wicker chairs. Every detail spoke of patience and precision, from the period-accurate crown molding to the custom built-ins he'd designed for Nadia's growing book collection. In the kitchen, the heart of their new life, Nadia sat at the oversized island he'd built specifically for her homework sessions. She had her father's focus, the ability to sit still with a problem until it yielded its secrets. Her math notebook showed careful columns of work, each step documented with the methodical clarity he'd taught her. Some habits, it seemed, ran in families. "Need any help?" he asked, measuring coffee beans into the grinder. She shook her head, eraser tapping thoughtfully against her chin. "I think I see where I went wrong. Give me a minute." The kitchen filled with morning light through windows he'd expanded himself, illuminating the space they'd made their own. Photos lined the walls, Nadia's school portraits, candid shots of Sunday dinners with Claudette, moments caught between tasks and transitions. Life, documented with an engineer's eye for detail and a father's instinct for what mattered. The consulting firm had grown beyond his initial projections. The municipal infrastructure contract that had seemed ambitious 18 months ago now formed the foundation of a broader practice. He'd brought in Marcus Chen as partner, a structural engineer whose reputation for innovative urban design complemented Damon's expertise in systems integration. Their client list expanded steadily, each project building on the last. The original $2.3 million contract had renewed with additional scope. The ownership stake negotiations proceeded with the measured pace of decisions meant to last. His net worth, conservatively calculated, now stood at 5 times what Yvette's divorce filing had assumed. The commercial property in the developed corridor continued appreciating, its tenants stable and its revenue steady. Sunday dinners had become a tradition that anchored their weeks. Claudette brought her famous mac and cheese and sharp observations about life, delivered with the particular wisdom of retired teachers. She and Nadia worked puzzles after dinner, while Damon cleaned up, their conversation flowing easily between generations. When playoff season rolled around, Terrence claimed his spot on the sectional Damon had carefully selected for optimal viewing angles. They watched games with the comfortable silence of old friends, breaking it only for strategic analysis or to debate controversial calls. Nadia joined them sometimes, more interested in the statistics than the sport itself, another inheritance from her father. The yard remained a work in progress, exactly as he liked it. He'd terraced the back slope to create level gardens, installing irrigation systems with the same attention he gave to city-scale water management. Each weekend brought new projects, a stone path here, a raised bed there, the slow transformation of space into place. He wasn't bitter. That surprised some people who knew the story. But bitterness required sustained attention to past injuries. Damon had moved forward with the same deliberate focus he brought to everything else. He was building something new, not maintaining grievances. The fall evening settled around him as he sat on the back porch, coffee steam rising in the cooling air. The Adirondack chair, another weekend project built from carefully selected cedar, held the comfort of things made by hand. From here, he could see the garden beds he'd prepared for spring planting, the workshop where he stored tools in perfect order, the tire swing he'd hung for Nadia from the old oak tree. His phone buzzed against the arm of the chair. Months ago, he'd set up a business news alert with her name. Not from obsession, but from the same practical instinct that made him document everything. He picked up the phone, read the headline once. Harmon Luck's CEO steps down amid ongoing board review. The words held no power. They were simply information, like weather reports or traffic updates. He set the phone face down on the chair's arm, lifted his coffee, and looked out at the yard he was still shaping. The evening light caught the dew on the grass he'd sodded himself, each careful row still holding true to the lines he'd laid. He felt nothing except, quietly, free. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.